Hello everyone, and welcome to the HEC Paris Executive Education Virtual Conference Rooms for webinar series. When joining the virtual conference room, you will notice that your microphone have been switched off. You will, however, be able to ask and make comments using the chat. The moderators will relay your questions and comments to our professors. We would also like to remind you that the webinar is being broadcasted live on YouTube. So we will be starting in about 5 minutes. Thank you. Hello everyone, and welcome again to the HEC Paris Executive Education Virtual Conference Room for our webinar series. When joining the virtual conference room, you'll notice that your microphones have been switched off. You will, however, be able to ask questions and make comments using the chat. And the moderators will relay your questions and comments to a professor. And also note that the webinar, is being broadcasted live on YouTube as we speak. So we'll begin the webinar in about 1 minute. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, hello everyone, and a very warm welcome to you all. I am Nicolas Lemoine, Senior Executive Director for Custom Programs at HEC Paris. On behalf of the board of HEC Paris, all the faculty and all our teams, we hope you are all keeping well during these unprecedented times. As an academic institution, we believe that the current situation lends itself to reflection, and that the best way to support you is to share the analysis of HEC Paris professor. The presentation will last about 30 minutes and will be followed by a 15 minutes question and answer session. There are many of you today from all over the world, but we will do our best to respond to your question. With us today is Jeremy Guez, Associate Professor of Economics and International Affairs. And this afternoon, Jeremy, you are going to speak to us and to try to answer the following question: will the coronavirus lead to economic decoupling and deglobalization? Jeremy, the floor is yours.
Can everyone hear me?
Hello, Jeremy. Yes, we can hear you.
I am very sorry. It feels like the coronavirus had the better of my computer, if not me. So I apologize, and I appreciate you guys waiting for this. Thank you for coming. It's really a great honor to be with you guys at this most difficult time for so many of us around the globe. So I appreciate you being with me today. I'd like to start and preface this by saying that I am not an MD. I am not a doctor. I am not a pandemic expert, but I am an observer, an analyst interested with a special expertise in the business environment. That is the global environment in which companies do their business. And what is very striking to me right now is that as many people had intuition before that a tsunami was coming, that deep changes were coming to this business environment, it was very important, I think, that we had a conversation about, is this coronavirus going to be the tsunami we expect? Is this the before and the after that we were all expecting for quite some time? So this is what I'd like to discuss with you guys. What is going to be on the other side of this crisis? Is this a deglobalized world, as so many people are fearing or expecting or celebrating? Is this an image of economic decoupling that we've been talking about for so long? These are the questions that I'd love to explore with you guys today and to take questions with you. So if you could just share the next slide, please, and start with some definitions. The first one being, what do we mean by economic decoupling? So believe it or not, this is actually a Chinese fear that was expressed to me during a trip to China in early December of last year. It's basically saying that, you know, more and more the United States on the one hand and China on the other are developing according to standards, according to technologies, and are developing supply chains that are increasingly independent. Meaning in a world in which we were expecting more and more interdependence, that was the hallmark of globalization, well, this world is actually getting more and more independent, and it is getting more and more on one side and on the other. And the end of interdependence is scary to many Chinese strategists who fear that ultimately their bet on a one single global integrated market might not be the case anymore. It might not be what you expect anymore going down the line. So you would have basically a world still globalized, but dominated by two different systems. One is an American one is a Chinese one. So next slide, please. Then we can take this one step further. And please click again. This is basically what the economic advisor of 3M, Dambisa Moyo, was writing still at the same time, early December of last year, before the whole coronavirus. She said, look, take US-Chinese tensions, of course, but take populism in the European Union, take the risk of a global recession. This may challenge the way corporations actually work. It may put into question a wide range of assumptions, the way we start thinking about how global corporations work, how we basically use human resources in particular, financial resources, and so on and so forth. So if you push this to the extreme, it wouldn't even mean the existence of two global systems. It would mean the end of one single global integrated market, or in other words, deglobalization per se. So this is basically the fear that this coronavirus has brought in, starting in January, but even more so 3 months ahead in March, where we're wondering, is this the end of a system? And if you click on the next slide, please, you can see that this is certainly a legitimate question. And again, next slide, you see, you know, a wide range of front pages out there from all over the world, basically saying, you know, this might actually be the end of the world as we know it, or the end of one world as we know it, meaning, you know, there might actually be a new normal, a new setting, a new relationship that you might actually expect going down the line. So again, question legitimate, is this the tsunami, the coronavirus crisis? Is this the tsunami that we had intuition was going to happen at some point in time? Is this going to be the crisis with a before or an after? Is this basically what we were all expecting? So if you move on to the next slide, I'd love to know what you guys think before I go on and before I move on to this whole conversation. So we have a little poll, and for the people participating in the Zoom room, I'd love to know what you guys think. So is this really a game changer? So is this a game changer to the extent you think there'll be a before and an after? Is this a game changer, but you think there might be actually people tempted to still believe that business as usual might still be a possibility? Or number three, do you think that this is just a temporary crisis, not an economic one in nature, and that things will go back on track? So please go ahead and make your vote, take your vote, so that we basically see where this room stands. You have a little window that should have opened up, and that should give you the opportunity to vote. So will we get results, Florent?
Absolutely. Let's wait just a few more seconds because I see a lot of votes coming, and then I will display the results.
It's the suspense. So ladies and gentlemen, the voice has not gone down again. It's just that we're waiting for your responses. Aha. This is interesting. So half and half, more or less, who expect, or equal share, I mean, who basically expect that this will transform the global economy. Another big chunk, almost 4 the voters different, so not that much, who think it will be, but it's going to be a long time changing, I guess, that might be. And then a small percentage of you who think this is still a temporary crisis. So I think this is a very interesting debate because, again, there are many open questions. There are many things that we are still discussing. There are many issues where we're not entirely sure on what to expect going down the line. But I think this is a legitimate question that we should explore. At the very least, and this is what I'd like to show you, my analysis suggests that this crisis is actually going to question 4 fundamental assumptions about how the world works. 4 fundamental assumptions that I think that even if one proves to be not true anymore going down the line, then it will definitely create a real challenge to globalization as we know it. And as a result of that, we might actually need to think about what do we do going down the line when it comes to business models, when it comes to doing business in a world that might be slightly less globalized or in a world that might look like something fundamentally different. So if you can change the slide, please. The first assumption I think that we can challenge is freedom of movement. So I opportunistically chose this picture that I think many of you saw, the number of Americans rushing back home once President Donald Trump announced a virtual ban on travel coming from the European Union and coming from Europe, where many Americans from abroad came back home. This, to me, is a fundamental symbol, I think, of freedom of movement. Will this actually come to be challenged going down the line? If you click again, please, the Financial Times had, I think, the greatest illustration in all of this, saying, look, you know, this is an experiment in deglobalization because supply chains don't work anymore. You have lower business confidence, you have less international trade, and to which I would add, you even have basically people who fundamentally fear for their own freedom and their own ability to move. And this is coming from a Parisian at the heart of Paris who obviously can't move anymore. If there is no more freedom of movement in this world, then I think that a lot of things that we've been betting on in terms of our mobility, our ability to move all around the world, services, goods, and so on and so forth, that might actually create a wide range of sources of disruption for business going down the line. And that might be one of the questions that we might ask. Assumption number 2, if you'll click on the next slide, please. I'm old enough to remember a period at which we used to tell people that, you know, everything you know and in everything you need to know, you will always get to that information, in particular because, you know, the internet will be the heaven of transparency. You will basically always be able to get to the data you actually need, and everyone will know everything at the same time. If you click on the next slide, I think this is a very eloquent illustration of why that might actually be wrong. This is not a question of democracy. This is not a question of freedom. It's more a question of transparency. So you have on the upper part of this graph, this is from the Financial Times as well, searches for the Wuhan virus, Wuhan pneumonia. You see a little spark on Baidu on the lower end. This is where most Chinese citizens do their internet searches. And you see that little spike when the first case or the first discussion comes up at the end of 2019. That spike is very, very modest on the Google side, and people in the West don't pay, or outside China, I should say, don't pay that much attention. But then interest is going to grow and grow and grow outside of China, and is going to peak, especially at January 5th. This is where Singapore reports its own first case of the Wuhan crisis, Wuhan virus, or the coronavirus as we know it now. Whereas you see on the Baidu side, on the Chinese side, censorship does its job and basically keeps this under the lid for quite some time until just before January 20th, when there's a boom and an explosion, when Chinese authorities probably cannot keep this under the lid anymore and cannot keep this from their population anymore. What is very striking to me here is that assumption number 2, do we always have the information we need? Will the internet always provide the accuracy? We had a few hints in the past 3 or 4 years that that might not be the case. I think that ultimately this coronavirus will prove to be a very big challenge on this assumption on the type of information we need. Do we have it or not? Most likely, we might not have complete information going down the line. That was for assumption number 2, folks. If you please click on the next slide. Assumption number 3 is this notion that trust in institution will actually be eternal and forever. So I think there might be a little glitch on this that I had corrected, but anyway, Florent, should I take a moment to open up on my end, maybe the slides?
Sure, if we can we can try that.
So just a few words, and just saying a few words illustrating this. What is very, very striking is that in this whole discussion about what is new actually today and what is not, it is very striking to me that, okay, well, I don't think this is working. You can click on that link a little bit later on when you guys have the chance, but the 2020 Edelman Trust Barometer actually shows this very well. A growing chunk of the population surveyed, 56% of it, is questioning the virtues of the capitalist system. It is increasingly asking, is the capitalist system actually really going to bring everything that we actually need going down the line? A growing amount express a lot of fears. 83% are saying, you know, I depend somehow on the gig economy, and it's not basically proving what I actually need. And the result of all of this distrust, so if you move 2 slides, please, Florent, is exactly there. You basically end up with no institution, according to the Edelman Barometer, seen as ethical and competent. And even worse, you see 2 major bodies who play a major role in the coronavirus, namely the government and the media, seen as not so competent and not so ethical, meaning you have a true trust in institutions. That means what? It means ultimately that those authorities that in yesterday's world, we would have trusted to basically bring us out of the crisis. In yesterday's world, that we would have looked to for leadership, to explain to us what should we be doing, what should we be avoiding to do going down the line. Well, as a result, we really do not have that anymore. We don't have that trust. So we're basically looking at a world in which basically we might not have that leadership, and we may not have that trust capital that we used to have. So that was for assumption 3. Trust in institutions is actually eroding, and this might actually be another key feature of that new normal of the business environment that we might see going down the line. Would you click on the next slide, please? Number 4, which is the one I think is even more interesting, is that we expect change to always be linear. That's the assumption we always make, that change is always linear, that it's always in a gradual way. We saw on the stock market that it's actually very, very large swings, that things keep on changing all the time, that from a very, very bad swing, and you see this from our friends from Statista, that basically, you know, since 1987, we saw one of the second largest percentage loss. And since 1933, one of the 4th largest growth ever. So this shows the type of uncertainty that we're actually facing. Will you click on the next slide, please? And we're seeing as well deep questions regarding, you know, the practices of the past. This is from BlackRock Investment Institute a couple of days ago, that basically computed, you know, the different stimulus surges that you see in a wide range of countries. It has been made clear by many public authorities that we're in a setting in which nobody is betting on yesterday's rules, especially in the European Union when it comes to deficits, when it comes to debt. No one is abiding by them anymore, that we will do whatever it takes. That's an expression that keeps on coming up to save this. So again, what seem to be the sacrosanct rules, even for the European Union, even for the most fiscal conservatives, has blown up to pieces. And this too is a very big paradigm shift, it seems, going down the line. Will you click on the next slide, please, Florent? This too I find to be quite impressive. This is the weekly jobless claims in the United States. when you think about a new normal, the previous record was in 1982, and you see that surge right over there, October, end of the year, at 600, nearly 700,000. Last Thursday, it reached 3.3 million. So again, we expect change to be linear. We expect all of this to be step by step. And we're seeing that we might actually be accelerating into a new normal that is fundamentally different than the one that we have been experiencing from now. This has obviously political implications. Will you click on the next slide, please? For the social middle, the lower middle class and the working class, they were the ones most likely that paid the most significant cost of the 2008 crisis. I think there's a lot of fears that if they pay yet again a significant tribute in this most latest crisis, then you might actually say goodbye to the whole concept of middle class. You might have to accept a very polarizing view of society more and more and more. And as a result of that, there might actually not be the same market to sell goods to anymore. Again, that might be a significant rupture from yesterday's world, especially the post World War II world. But I think it really, really sets our mind on, what might actually be coming next, especially after the new normal, after this crisis is done. Will you click on the next slide, please? And clearly, politically, so the Chinese authorities experienced that test. We know from people who work on Chinese social media, who observe them and who translate them, that there was a lot of discontent expressed towards Chinese authorities on how they handled the crisis. We know for a fact as well that, too many times we basically placed a really, really big premium on the stability of the Chinese system. I was having lunch a couple of weeks ago, just before confinement, with a Chinese expert who was telling me, maybe we're betting a little bit too much on the stability of this system. We actually don't know how much support President Xi has inside. And if you click again, please, you see this will have ramifications for Donald Trump going down the line, especially him who saw himself as the CEO of that corporation that we call United States. If he's not competent anymore or not seen as competent anymore to overcome this crisis. And if you click one last time, this is the front page of a French magazine that I never agree with, that is very right-wing, but I think that captures very much the sentiment of a part of the population, namely that this world has failed and that, the pandemic that we're going through is basically putting into question a wide range of assumptions we made about frontiers, about sovereignty, about family, and so on. And therefore, a new world is about to come. So if you click on the next slide, again, I think the jury is still out on this, but I think there's plenty of evidence to suggest that the new normal might be different from the world we know as we know it right now. Again, we're going to need to look for signs, but I want to share with you just this simple thinking. 4 assumptions that I shared with you. If any of them are actually challenged, then we're set for a whole new business environment. And this is going to have ramifications, I think, for how business operates and how they basically think about the type of talents and the type of ideas that they want actually to look for. So I'd like to know, second question that I'd like to ask you guys, what type of actors are best placed to reinvent in this? So do you think it's global companies? Do you think it's companies with strong ties to local economies? Do you think it's Asian companies? Do you think it's Western companies? Do you think it's tech giants? Do you think it's luxury? Or do you think it's all type of actors that are best placed to actually reinvent? And obviously you can choose more than one answer in all of this, but let's see if we can see any trends in terms of sectors perhaps, or in terms of geographic locations, or in terms of company profiles for that matter. So I'll let you guys give a little bit of time. Give you guys a little bit of time to vote. And Florent, will you tell us when?
Absolutely.
Someone is saying startups. I should have put startups on there, but fair enough. We're still here, ladies and gentlemen, just expecting your votes to see where this Yes, and someone is writing, even business schools need to reinvent. Whoever said that, you're absolutely right. And I'll give you a little bit of a premiere. I have an op-ed exactly on that topic about business schools and how they will need to reinvent, coming soon to you, and a few ideas on this. All right, so a lot of people want to say startups. Yeah, well, see, this is congruent with a lot of the simulations and the experiments that I've conducted in my own classrooms. Significant majority basically say companies with strong ties to local economies. And I think many, many people agree with that. Interestingly enough, tech giants, could you just put that again for me? I'm sorry, if it's possible. So I saw tech giants, probably more than luxury, apparently. I'll say a few words about luxury in a second. And on Asian and Western, it seemed like it was pretty even. So if we go to the next slide, please. And, the lessons, or at least the key takeaways in this. Yesterday's new normal, this was the reality. So if you'll click again, you guys will all recognize Amazon's flywheel. This notion of basically saying, a virtuous cycle where you can always bet on the global market for growth that will basically, set forth a really, really nice virtuous cycle, and that will help all of you guys basically move forward with this. That was yesterday's new normal. But if we're dealing with something that is far more local than what it used to be, if we're dealing with something that can't bet on one global, single, integrated market worldwide, then I think that what we really need to think about is what is the new model that might actually come. So if you'll click again on this, what I'd like to point out is that these guys, the Amazon guys, the platform companies, think about yourself right now. So if you're in confinement, that might not work. But if you went outside in regular times and you wanted to get an Uber or a fly or any form of transportation online, that would be a very local platform when you think about it, because you might not care whether the company is based in the Silicon Valley or anywhere else. You really, really want something local. So I think all of these firms might actually have the infrastructure, might actually have the DNA to have an impact locally, but you're going to have a quantum leap when it comes to how do you use those resources and how do you rethink your engagement inside society going down the line. So the merits of going local, I see a lot of you guys online, but I see a lot of you guys as well in my classes saying the same thing. There is value to be created. Someone mentioning 3D printing, and I think you're absolutely right. Technology, and this is a little bit what I meant, but thank you for helping me make that even clearer. Technology is basically creating a system in which we have the tools to actually remain local. Even with 3D printing, we see this in this crisis where it's being used to basically print masks. You might actually not need anymore that global integrated supply chain as you needed it in the past. And this is basically creating, I think, new opportunities to shine, even in a world that is not as globalized as it used to be. Will you please click on the next slide? Yeah, and I think that we now know for a fact that shared value is not a marginal idea anymore. So you might remember the idea of shared value. This was the front page of the Harvard Business Review in 2011. Where Michael Porter and Mark Kramer basically argued, look, the shared value idea is basically quite simple. We used to think of profitability as something very simple, a very simple equation that firms could rely on to maximize their profits. I think the idea is still that you will need to maximize profits going down the line. I don't think that you will put that in question anytime soon. And by the way, the subtitle was How to Fix Capitalism. But I think that what is interesting about all of this is that more and more and more people will basically bet on this notion of saying, I need to invest in my ecosystem. Because if I don't invest in my ecosystem, it might be run from within. It might actually collapse from within. And then in that case, all bets are off because I won't have any more markets to sell my stuff to. You see this with big groups in France, in Europe, and throughout the world. In the United States, car companies starting to build ventilators. In France, we have LVMH building a gel for the hands. And what is interesting in all of these examples is that people have asked me, is this just a question of reputation? To which I answer, yes, of course, it is a question of reputation. In the case of the US, there is a mandate, a political mandate to actually make it happen, not in the case of LVMH. But I think that there's also the idea of saying we need to invest in this ecosystem. We need to accelerate our ability to basically move out of the crisis, because if we don't, then again, the system might actually collapse from within. And there is no necessary contradiction between the interest of the firm and the interest of society as a whole. And this is exactly what shared value is about, a congruence of interest, a convergence of interest that some companies have clearly identified and are basically betting on. And I think this too is a form of reinvention. Will you click on the next slide, please? This might mean less globalization, or people betting a little bit less on a global single united economy or united global integrated market, I mean. But what is as well interesting to me is that that might not mean the end of globalization per se. And I think that in this globalized world, what we're gonna need is basically rediscovering what it actually means to be different. What it actually means to be different, and basically, what do we actually do in order to showcase unique products? And if you click again, please, showcase, what really makes us different as a region, as a nation, or even as a company. So, can we basically invest in the resources that actually matter? And this might actually be a little bit controversial because, from time to time, this might mean accepting that some jobs go abroad. It might mean accepting job destructions to some extent. Why? Well, because when we accept job destruction, we basically are saying to these people, we need to get you in a place where we do not waste your talents. And that reconversion is going to have to happen at some point in time. And this is going to be a healthy debate about global trade. Why do we trade? Why do we consume? How do we consume? There will always be the jambon de Bayonne or the cupcakes in Georgetown, or those absolutely impossible to emulate lukums that you find right there in Istanbul, or Chinese food that you can only find at the heart of Beijing. Those will always be the type of things that we will never be able to imitate. That will be what globalization is about, trying to showcase the true products that people can't get anywhere else. For all of the rest, what can we do in a more local scale at a more efficient use of resources? This debate is certainly not new. It's about the strategic advantages that we can draw from this. We might have gotten lost in this whole debate about differentiation. I think that in this new normal, we're going to have that healthy debate yet again. If you click on the last slide, on the next slide, and this is one of the other points that I think expect a debate on this, please click again, the value of outsourcing related to the past point. There is a worthwhile question about all of this. Not everyone will be happy with the conclusions of this debate, but the outsourcing reversal has already begun. People are starting, and companies are starting to resource again, and they didn't wait for the coronavirus. So as we get local, supply chains might actually shrink to some extent, but we're going to have to be very careful because that might have a significant impact on the purchasing power of populations, especially Western ones, and might actually create a fundamental problem, social effects of Asian middle classes as well. So we're going to have to be careful about this whole debate about outsourcing, but it's necessarily going to come. And I think related to the previous point, we're going to have to ask, what do we outsource? Why do we outsource it? Is the cost question still relevant? Is it more of a talent question now? And is it still in a way that is an efficient use of resources? This debate is also coming to you very quickly. And if you click on the last slide, on the next slide, please, and this is a whole debate. The slides will be available. Christian Gaulier is an economist that I invite you to follow because I think he has his eyes on these questions. This tweet was in French. He tweets a lot in English, and I think he captures a lot of these economic debates coming up. If you'll click on the next slide, please. Last but not least, we're going to have a debate on diversity, ultimately. And the coronavirus tells us the question about diversity is not a test anymore. there was an interview with a French doctor in French press a couple of days ago that struck a nerve with me for so many reasons. But that basically said, you know, blame politicians all you want for the coronavirus, but we might need to have a conversation as well about the advisors of politicians. They go to the same school, they read the same reports, they have the same network, so there's a lot of groupthink happening there. Diversity might actually be able to help us break that groupthink. That might help us burst those bubbles and might need to help us basically start to think about these things in a very different way. If you click again, please, I think what is very, very interesting in all of this is that, again, you know, diversity can't be a buzzword anymore. A lot of firms today say, oh yes, we are a diverse firm. We're a firm that basically promotes diversity, but it's a little bit like the firm saying, this is all about sustainability and we want to be a sustainable firm. I often hear greenwashing. What I want to know is, strategically speaking, how do you use diversity? In a world in which we know for a fact we're going to have to generate a wide range of new ideas, a wide range of novel ideas, we're going to have to think about how in the world do we do that? And it is not with the advisors, probably mostly from the same gender, probably with the same education, probably from the same, reading the same type of reports, that we're going to get this type of feedback. And therefore, we're going to have to rethink the way we train advisors, even on the school side. And I know this is as well a responsibility on the academic side. This debate is open. It's time for a change very quickly. And as I was saying, I will basically be writing an op-ed on these questions that will be made available very soon. If you'll click on the next slide, please. So we have the new normal. We understand what it might look like. We understand the ongoing debates about local, about what this means for resources, what this means about globalization, what this means for outsourcing, what this means for diversity, and ultimately about how do we train talents and how do we recruit talents and where do we go and look for talents. This is a very broad debate. As I said initially, I am not an expert in the coronavirus. What I can foresee, though, is that this crisis is basically questioning fundamental assumptions about how the world will work going down the line. And those of us who get ready for this, might actually have a strategic advantage. This is an ongoing debate. So if you click again, please, this is going to be, was at the heart already of a book I wrote, and that was, published last September. It's basically talking about, in this hot, crowded, unstable world, how do you go look for talent? What type of transformations must you go through in order to build and live in a turbulent business environment? This obviously did not talk about the coronavirus, published in September, but it certainly offers a lot of tools for a toolbox to navigate this turbulent business environment. And that sets the right sets of questions. And if you click again, the MOOC that we put together at HEC Paris on strategic foresight, anticipating your next battle and beyond. It is available on Coursera, free to do it. This too was giving a set of tools to basically monitor the business environment and start thinking about the business environment in a different way and start reinventing for the type of changes that you foresee, especially for the type of changes that you might foresee with the coronavirus. I hope that we can continue this debate. If you click on the next slide, please. This is how you can reach me. I try to publish as much as I can on LinkedIn to get this debate going, so I hope we can interact there. I'm also available on Twitter, so by all means, please. For some reason, LinkedIn works more than Twitter these days, at least in my case. So by all means, please follow me and we'll continue this exchange. You also have my personal website right here. Again, this is really an open symphony. Listen to the doctors, listen to the pandemic experts that will tell you what we need to do in the very short run. At HEC Paris, we're not doctors or MDs rather. We are not expert in pandemics, but we do have some form of intuition about what might be waiting for us on the other side of this crisis. And this was a little bit of the intuition that I wanted to share with you. Some of my colleagues will actually share even more intuition on the strategy side, on making decisions, on reinventing business models per se. And I really invite you guys to follow those webinars as well that will be act as complements to this one. So thank you very much for joining us. And I think there's a last slide reminding everyone where to find more information about all of the programs that we have at HEC Paris for managers, for senior executives, for anyone looking to pursue all of this. And one last word, we have developed a lot of expertise on the side of business environment as well. So if you're interested in all of this, I'm sure you'll find a program that is of interest to you. Nicolas, thank you for your patience. And again, sorry for the initial issues. Let's blame the coronavirus for now.
That's no problem, Jeremy. I almost died, but that's no problem. It will not be a surprise, but we receive an uninterrupted flow of questions for you. And the first one is coming from India, from Vivek. And Vivek is saying that after 2008, we swore that the system would change. But obviously, as you said, it didn't. So how do we know this time it is different?
Yeah. Thank you, Nicolas, and thank you, Vivek, for that question. I think it's an important one. Fundamentally, the answer might be we don't know. It might be business as usual, or as many people said, maybe it might not be business as usual, but people will want to do this and go back to business as usual. So it might not be any different from the 2008 crisis. Here's what I think is different. I think many people suffered tragic consequences of the 2008 crisis. In this case, I think everyone, to some extent, suffered the consequences of this crisis, especially when you consider confinement, especially, so now it's not just Europe, it's part of the United States. Is it part of India or India as a whole? Certainly. So we're living this in terms of our freedom of movement. I also think that more and more people, contrary to 2008 and contrary to that pure financial crisis that 2008 was, are increasingly aware of the fact that, there's a climate urgency. What is the bridge between the coronavirus and the climate urgency? I think the jury is still out on this too. The preliminary answers that I've seen is basically that, deforestation, among many other things, are increasing the interactions between the wildlife and human beings. And that might be a fundamental driver in the early contamination happening in China. So this climate urgency is not a test anymore either. I think an increasing amount of people, still too small of a chunk of people if you ask me, my personal opinion, but I think an increasing amount of people is increasingly upset with this, and this might actually drive political change to some extent as well. So I think Vivek is right to wonder about this. There is an argument to be made that things might not change by September once we're out of confinement, but I still see 2 or 3 hints of evidence that suggest that there are drivers or there are objective reasons to think that the world will fundamentally change going down the line.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. The next question is coming from the United States. Helen would like to ask you, and that's not a surprise, what effect all these crises will have on the US elections?
Yeah, well, that's the $1 million question. There are 2 types of effects that I can imagine right now. Number one is probably the most straightforward one, is if indeed this crisis and the confinement that it triggers in the United States leads to a recession, in which case, recessions have never been kind to incumbent presidents. Just to give you a very brief historical example, George Bush the father, George H.W. Bush the father, extremely popular president for the first 2 years of his mandate, builds a coalition, international coalition to move Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. This was an international coalition that was well supported, contrary to the Second Gulf War. Very, very popular president. 1991, late 1991, the United States enters a recession and all hell breaks loose for George Bush and his presidency. You guys know the rest of the story. He loses to Bill Clinton in 1992. We know recessions can be extremely hard on incumbent presidents. If the coronavirus creates a recession, this might be hard on Donald Trump. Second thing that I wonder about is basically, is this going to hurt his image in terms of competence? You know that Donald Trump loves to introduce himself as the CEO of the United States, very efficient CEO of the United States, basically saying, you know, I'm a businessman, I know how to do this. If American starts to question that image, then maybe that might be trouble. A big caveat, in order to prepare for this, I went to look at the numbers of George W. Bush in 2005 during the Hurricane Katrina that hit, you might remember, Louisiana very, very hard. New Orleans, especially, very, very hard. What was striking to me was that I expected George Bush's ratings to actually drop after Katrina. It didn't. So I'm not entirely sure the competence issue actually plays a role, but it could going down the line. So you got the recession part, you got the competence part that could make the life of Donald Trump very hard in a re-election year. That being said, don't ever underestimate Donald Trump, his ability to reinvent himself, his ability to imagine how to pull himself out of a crisis and blame someone else. He's very good at doing that. He has been very good at mastering the political game up until now. And I think part of arguing about what the new world might look like might actually be forgetting about yesterday's world, namely Katrina in 2005 and George H.W. Bush in 1991 might be completely irrelevant examples for all I know. They're the only ones I know and the only guides I know right now, but they might prove to be irrelevant potentially. That's how I would think about the future of the US election process going down the line.
Thank you, Jeremy. And as Marcus just rightly noticed, Donald Trump is calling himself a wartime president because during wartime, you do not replace the president. Yeah. So the future will tell us whether it's true or not. There's a question coming at the same time from Giancarlo in Milan and Frédéric in Lyon in France. And it's the same question, which is a little bit tricky. Will the European Union survive the crisis?
Okay, so if the previous question was the $1 million question, that's the $3 million question. When there is a crisis, you know for a fact that the European legitimacy will be put into question. It was the case in 2008, and even afterwards in 2010 during the whole Euro crisis, when many people started to question whether or not, the Germans and the rest of the European Union, or put differently, Northern Europe and Southern Europe, would actually be able to find a compromise to continue living together. You see a little bit of the similar issues here. I think many of our Italian friends and Italian authorities felt a little bit abandoned by the European Union. And the same way, you have this nationalistic temptation of basically saying, if we had closed down all the borders, it wouldn't have never happened. You would have had other problems, though, in addition to that. For all of the fears that I understand, for all of the questions about Europe's efficiency that I understand and I find legitimate too, then we also have to look at all of the evidence that suggests that the European is on top of its game. This can be very specific examples, but decisive ones, like French people who are sick today in the east of the country, in Alsace especially, are being moved towards Germany because the Alsace region can't basically take care of all of the sick people anymore. So they're being moved to Germany. So you have evidence of cooperation there. But I think the even more striking example of this was when last week, Europe basically says, we're going to save the European economy, again, whatever it takes. Whatever it takes means all of the sacrosanct rules related to the 3% on deficit, the 60% rule on debt that has been long forgotten anyway, all of these are suspended for now. This proves to me that the European Union is up to the task, that it understands the nature of the war economy that you have to put forward. I think that you have to be careful, because if you just spend money and put money at the problem, you might very well not have the infrastructure to face the next pandemics. And this is where we expect the European Union to play a role. So you're going to need a lot of leadership. You're going to need a lot of consultation. But I think up until now, you have fertile ground to believe in the success of the European Union. The next open question, in my opinion, is, will Emmanuel Macron, Angela Merkel, or someone else for that matter, step up to the plate and offer a long-term vision? One final point on that, Emmanuel Macron in France has said on at least two occasions that he doesn't believe that business as usual will be possible, that he says that there are many rules, market-based rules that we're going to need to revise. I'm interested in knowing what he has in mind. This hasn't been very explicit yet, in my opinion. I'm interested in knowing what he has in mind and the degree to which he will be able to convince his European partners going down the line. And I think that can play a positive role as well in not only saving the European Union, but reinventing it and making it even more relevant for today, for tomorrow's world.
Thank you, Jeremy. Although we imagine not to take more, and we cannot obviously take all questions, would you agree to take a final one?
Of course.
Yeah, I think I noticed it because it's more than which has been shared both by several people, and I cannot name all of them, but there is Saddam in Iraq, there is Arsh in India, and several other people, and I've rephrased a little bit the question, and in essence, it is, will this crisis lead to unity between nations?
Yeah. So this is a difficult question because you have to be careful and not to do some wishful thinking. I mean, as a citizen, I would certainly hope so. You see many different things happening at the same time. You see people getting on the phone and talking to each other. This is very important to me because when I read history books about the 1930s depression, what was interesting is that many historians emphasize on the fact that no one was really talking to each other at the time. So this is, I think, is a form of progress that we should not underestimate. I also think that this being a global pandemic, what is very interesting is that it has showed us the very vulnerabilities we face when it comes to our interdependence on one another. So we need to organize that interdependence. So that's on the positive side. On the negative side, I mean, you see a country like China trying to benefit from this. Who wouldn't? And I do not blame them. But I think revisiting stories about this crisis, suggesting many things that I think aren't exactly true. And we need to be careful about these things too. There's always a temptation to resort to nationalism, to resort to rivalries, and this is not a monopoly of China. The United States does this, and I can almost be sure that you will expect this and that we should expect this in the European Union going down the line. I think that the real question is, in terms of balance, can we reinvent governance? Here is a key item on the calendar. It will be in Saudi Arabia for the G20 this fall. Will this be like the G20 meeting in February or March 2009 in London, where a bunch of leading economies just met and basically decided to shake hands? And because we had faced basically the bottom of point for stock markets, and they were starting to go back up at the time, then everyone said, well, it'll be okay. We'll do a few reforms and everything is going to work out. I wonder if that's what's going to be the next G20 meeting about, or if in the G20 meeting, you're going to see Saudi Arabia, you're going to see MBS, the Crown Prince, with a true vision, a true agenda, offering a true vision of what the future governance might look like in terms of consultation, perhaps giving the WHO a greater role in terms of doing this, perhaps giving the scientific community a greater role in doing this. And I think this is going to be a very, very interesting debate that we're going to see. If Saudi Arabia wants to, enhance its reputation and wants to basically find a new way to reinvent itself, this is where the opportunity lies, in my opinion. And this is where it will be able to find a new compromise and promote something that many nations can agree on. I hope that was answering to some extent the question, Nicolas.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. Unfortunately, we cannot answer all questions. There are probably hundreds, if not thousands, of questions. So I hand over now to the master of ceremony, Florent.
And Florent, well, if you can just put the previous slide for one last second. And I'd just like to tell everyone, I'm sorry if we couldn't get to your questions, but by all means, you guys know where to continue this debate. So I'll be happy to continue. Please connect on LinkedIn, on Twitter, and and check out the website, and I'll be happy to continue this debate with all of you. Thank you very much for joining.
Thank you, Jérémy and Nicolas. On behalf of HEC Paris, I would like to thank you again all, and many of you for taking part in this web conference, and we hope you can join us for other webinar. Good evening and have a good day.